January 3rd, 1833. A British warship called HMS Clio sails into Berkeley Sound in the South Atlantic. On shore, there's a tiny Argentine garrison, maybe 25 soldiers. They've been there a few months. Their settlement is barely functional. An American warship had wrecked its defences and stripped it of what little control it had about a year earlier. Since then, there's been a mutiny. The commander was murdered by his own men. Captain James Onslow meets the Argentine commander, Jose Maria Pinedo. Onslow is polite but clear. Britain is resuming control of these islands. He asks Pinedo to lower his flag and leave. Pinedo looks at his situation. His ship is outgunned. Many of his sailors are British-born and won't fight their own countrymen. No hope of reinforcement. He knows exactly what the next 5 minutes look like if he refuses. He lowers the flag. He gathers his soldiers. He sails away. No shots fired. The civilians were not expelled. Darwin arrives 2 months later and describes them still living there. That is what gets taught as a national tragedy, and 149 years later, boys in Argentine uniforms froze on East Falkland because of that story.
So, how did we get here? How did a bloodless handover become a national founding myth? Why did Britain send one of the largest naval task forces since the Second World War to reclaim these rocks? That story involves Spain sending 5 warships and 1,400 men to take on a tiny British garrison. An American warship turning up, effectively smashing what little order existed. A mutiny that ended in murder. A dictator who thought he could steal territory to distract from killing his own people. And a referendum so overwhelming it should have ended the argument forever.
Let's start at the beginning. The Falkland Islands sit about 300 miles off Argentina's coast and 8,000 miles from Britain. There are 2 main islands plus hundreds of smaller ones, with a total land area roughly the size of Yorkshire. The climate is brutal, naturally treeless, with winds that can hit 100 miles per hour.
And when Europeans first arrived, nobody lived there. No indigenous population, nobody displaced, because nobody was there. That matters, because from the start, this was never about taking someone's homeland. It was about claims, administration, and who could actually hold the place over time.
So where does the claim even begin? The first recorded landing was English, Captain John Strong, 1690. He sailed through the strait between the 2 main islands, named it Falkland Sound, and documented the visit. That's where the name comes from, but he didn't stay. Nobody did for another 70 years. Then the 1760s happen and 3 empires start tripping over each other. In 1764, France makes the first real move, Port Louis on East Falkland, and they give the islands the name Les Îles Malouines, named after Saint-Malo, the port their ships sailed from. That is where Malvinas comes from, not Spanish, French. A year later, Britain arrives, unaware France is already there, sets up Port Egmont on the other side, and claims the whole lot for King George III. Now you've got 2 flags on 2 islands, and neither side thinks the other has any right to be there. Then Spain steps in. France transfers Port Louis to Spain in 1767. Spain takes over, renames it Puerto Soledad, and declares the entire archipelago Spanish. Britain refuses. Britain does not recognise Spanish sovereignty, and Britain is not leaving. So Spain tries to remove them. In 1770, 5 warships and 1,400 soldiers arrive at Port Egmont, and the British garrison is given a choice: leave or die. Outnumbered more than 10 to 1, they leave. Back in London, the reaction is immediate. Ships readied, troops mustered, Parliament furious, because this is not a local argument anymore. It is a direct challenge.
But France wants no part of a European war over the South Atlantic. Spain finds itself isolated, and in 1771, Britain is allowed back in. The flag goes back up. And this is the part that really matters later, because it's a paper trail. Britain comes back. Spain stays where it is. Yet no one signs a neat little paper to say who has the right over what. The dispute doesn't get closed. It gets left open, and it sits there, waiting. Then, in 1774, Britain withdraws the garrison due to cost and because the American colonies are at boiling point. But they leave a plaque, a flag, and a message stating that these islands belong to George III and his heirs indefinitely. Britain is taking a step back, but it is not relinquishing control.
Spain stayed at Puerto Soledad for decades, but the foundations were already cracking. Revolution is rolling across South America. Napoleon has Spain fighting for its own survival, and in 1811, the garrison is pulled out. Spain dismantles what it can and leaves. And once Spain leaves, the islands don't switch neatly to a new owner, they drop into a vacuum. No government, no administration, just passing whalers and sealers using the place like a stopover. This is the opening Argentina later points to, the moment they claim they can step in and inherit the lot. In 1816, the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata declares independence and says, "We inherit Spain's territory in the region, including the Falklands." But here's the catch, Spain's claim was never uncontested, and those older arguments didn't disappear just because a new country declared itself independent. That's the part people skip when they want a clean story. Still, in 1820, Colonel David Jewett sails to the ruins of Puerto Soledad, raises a flag in front of about 50 British and American sailors anchored nearby, and declares the islands belong to the United Provinces. Then he sails away. No settlement, no administration. The islands fall back into the same vacuum as before.
A few years later, a merchant named Louis Venet tried something smarter. He tried to establish a colony. And he was clever about it. He tried to secure cover from Buenos Aires while also sounding the British out, because he knew the claim was contested. For a while it worked. There was cattle, gauchos, and people living there, maybe 100 at its peak. It was definitely rough, but it was functioning. Then, Venet ruined it by picking a fight with the wrong country. He had exclusive fishing rights around the island, and in 1831, he tried to enforce them. He seized 3 American sealing ships. The USS Lexington sailed south with orders to free the ships and punish Venet. Captain Silas Duncan wrecked the settlement's defences, spiked the cannons, arrested the leaders, and declared the islands free from all government. As far as America was concerned, nobody owned these rocks.
The colony was gutted. Most of the population fled. Argentina sent a small garrison to restore order, but within months, those soldiers had mutinied and murdered their commander. And that takes you straight back to January 1833. A half-collapsed outpost, no stable authority, a flag coming down without a shot fired, civilians still there when Darwin turns up, and 2 sides who immediately tell the story in opposite directions. One calls it a return, the other calls it theft, and both sides know that what comes next is what really matters. From there, the story stops being theory and turns into decades of administration, supply, law, people arriving, people staying, people building lives, and people being born there. It turns into a place that exists in the real world, not just in speeches. For nearly 2 centuries, continuous British administration followed. They built Stanley, established proper government, brought in settlers who built lives, raised families, and created a community. A community Argentina has spent that entire time pretending doesn't matter.
Now, jump forward, because this is where the story stops being about history and starts getting people killed. Let's talk about General Leopoldo Galtieri. By 1982, Argentina had been ruled by a military junta for 6 years, one of the most brutal regimes in Latin American history. They called it the Dirty War. They kidnapped, tortured, and murdered somewhere between 10 and 30,000 people. Students, journalists, trade unionists. They threw people out of aircraft over the ocean. They stole the babies of murdered prisoners and gave them to regime supporters to raise. By 1982, the junta was collapsing. Economy in freefall. Atrocities impossible to hide. Protests growing. Galtieri needed something to unite the country. Something to make the people feel patriotic instead of angry. He looked at the Falklands.
On April 2nd, Argentine forces invaded. The tiny Royal Marine garrison, 68 men, fought hard but were hopelessly outnumbered. By the end of the day, the Argentine flag flew over Stanley. In Buenos Aires, crowds filled the Plaza de Mayo, the same square where mothers marched every week demanding to know what happened to their disappeared children. Now, those same crowds cheered Galtieri. The Malvinas were Argentine at last. Galtieri assumed Britain wouldn't fight. The islands were too far away. Thatcher's government had been cutting defence spending. Surely Britain would protest and accept the new reality. He was catastrophically wrong. Within 3 days, the British task force was sailing south. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, frigates, submarines, troop ships with the Paras and Royal Marines. 8,000 miles to cover. 74 days later, Argentine forces surrendered. Stanley was liberated. The Union Jack flew again. The cost was terrible. 255 British dead. 649 Argentine dead, many of them teenage conscripts who'd been told they were liberating an oppressed people and found themselves freezing in trenches, hungry and terrified, waiting for the Paras to come through the wire. Ships burned and sank in the freezing South Atlantic: Sheffield, Coventry, Atlantic Conveyor, Ardent, Antelope, Sir Galahad, with Welsh guardsmen trapped below decks at Bluff Cove. All of it because one dictator believed the story his country had been telling itself for 150 years. Galtieri was finished. The junta collapsed. Argentina returned to democracy. Galtieri spent his final years facing prosecution and died in disgrace. But the myth survived, still taught in Argentine schools, still on their money, still in their constitution. Every year politicians demand negotiations. Every year they call Britain colonial aggressors.
So, what is Argentina's case actually built on? Now you've seen the blood it costs, let's see what it rests on if you take away the chants and the flags. They have 3 claims: geography, inheritance, and the United Nations. Geography first. The islands are close to Argentina, therefore should be Argentine. But proximity has never determined sovereignty. France doesn't own the Channel Islands. Ireland doesn't own the Isle of Man. The United States doesn't own Cuba. Spain doesn't own Gibraltar. Distance from a mainland is completely irrelevant. What matters is what was actually done over time by governments. Inheritance second. Argentina claims they inherited Spain's rights at independence, but Spain's claim was contested from the start, and Spain walked away from the islands before Argentina even existed as a country. If the title was disputed and the place was abandoned, we inherited it, isn't the slam dunk it's sold as being. The United Nations third. Argentina loves citing Resolution 2065 from 1965. But read what Resolution 2065 actually says. It acknowledges the existence of a dispute, it calls for negotiations, it doesn't declare an owner, but it explicitly mentions the interests of the population of the Falkland Islands.
The interests of the population, not the pride of Buenos Aires, not what looks good in a speech, the interests of the people living there. The modern argument loves to pretend this is just 2 governments fighting over empty rocks. It isn't. It hasn't been for a long time.
So now, and only now, we get to the point that Argentina likes to quietly ignore, because it's the part that turns their story from heroic to awkward. The people who actually live on the Falklands.
About 3,400 people live there today. They speak English, they drive on the left, they use the pound. Some families have been there 9 generations. In 2013, they held a referendum, internationally observed, completely free and fair. Do you want to remain a British overseas territory? 99.8% voted yes, 3 people voted no. Argentina calls them implanted. It's a way of saying your voice doesn't count. Conveniently, that rule only seems to exist when it helps them, because if you apply it honestly, you end up demolishing half the modern world, including the country making the complaint. Now we can finally answer the question, without slogans, without shortcuts, and without pretending this is one simple point.
So why are the Falklands British? Because Britain maintained its claim when the dispute began, returned when it could, and then exercised continuous administration for generations. And because the people living there, in an overwhelmingly internationally observed vote, chose to remain British. That's the answer. All three parts together: claim, control, and contest. Remove any one of them, and you're not describing the Falklands. You're describing a talking point. That's the history. That's why Argentina invaded. That's why Britain didn't negotiate, and why Britain fought. If you want to see what that fight looked like, one of the largest bombing raids of all time, I've already covered Operation Blackbug on the channel, as well as Operation Prelim. I'm hoping to cover so many more battles and raids, yet also the historical context that goes along behind it, and most importantly, many of the important figures. I appreciate everyone for tuning into today's video. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It's my dream to get this channel to 1,000 subscribers. Bring on the next video. Appreciate everyone for watching. Thank you.